resistors against dysgenesis and modernity. This is Govan here with GovanKilgour.com. I've alluded to the fact that I was going to be doing some videos on macrocycles, and I did and opened that sort of idea and series, this ongoing theme, with the video about the age of Aquarius. And in this particular video, I want to talk about probably the next largest cycle. A lot of the other cycles just deal with single planets, but this is the combination of two planets, and when they conjunct, that is a 20-year cycle, but it is also within that a 200-year cycle and then an 800-year cycle. These ways that these add up to that I'll explain in the course of this video, but the main thing I wanted to start off with is to just explain some of the basic workings of both Jupiter and Saturn, these two planets that conjunct roughly every 19 to 20 years, and what that represents, and the one that we have coming up, what that means. There's one coming up December 21st, 2020. That is the first one beginning a new macrocycle, a new 200-year cycle. So the unique thing about this cycle is that into the visible eye, Jupiter and Saturn are these two slowest moving planets in the traditional astrological sky. Obviously, with the advent and rediscovery or discovery of Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, we have other things going on. So with these two slow outer moving planets, we have Jupiter, which is roughly a little over 12-year cycle, or maybe just slightly under. I don't have the exact number in front of me. But then the planet Saturn is just under 30-year orbit cycle, meaning number of years it takes to go around the sun, about 29 and a half years. And so the way that works out is that if you imagine the sun here and Jupiter is going around it, Saturn's also going around it, because of their rate of speed, you basically roughly get 3 laps of Saturn before Saturn gets back to where it was. So it's not quite perfect lap, otherwise it would just always be hitting the same 3 points on the zodiac ecliptic. But that is what causes those 3 conjunction points, which are roughly 3 points apart, to slowly move over time. And due to that being, these 3 points, this sort of triangle it creates on the wheel of the zodiac. So say Saturn is here in Aquarius, as it's coming up to in the end of this year, and Jupiter is going to hit where it is in Aquarius. Then as Jupiter will have passed it and be going around, and by the time it catches up to Saturn again, Saturn will be at the next point in that triangle. And that next point also happens to be an air sign like Aquarius. So this starts to give you the idea of what happens in these larger cycles, the larger 200-year cycle, which is the changeover of elements, because for about 200 years, the conjunction happens in the same elemental sign. And then it's slowly moving through them, and you hit that new sign, and then all 3 conjunctions that will happen will then be in a new set of signs. I'll put up some diagrams throughout this video so that is more understandable and not confusing, especially if you're newer to astrology. But this is also a very easy way to get familiarized with the layout of the zodiac wheel, because you have the elements. There's 4 elements ascribed to the 12 signs, which leaves 3 signs to each element. And interestingly, if you also are familiar with the hermetic or esoteric understanding of the elements and their symbols, you'll probably be familiar with these diagrams where each element is represented by a triangle with a different line at different points through it. And so you have earth, air, water, and fire. And whether one came from the other, the triangle from just observing the zodiac wheel and the way they place these and create those associations, I don't know which came first, but that is a link up there, and it's an interesting thing. A lot of people don't realize if they've studied one or the other in depth, they might not see the association there in their symbolic representation. So you have this trine aspect that happens with these conjuncts in 20-year intervals. And due to the nature of retrogrades as well, all of the planets at certain points throughout the year, or even sometimes it's longer than a year, have a point where they go retrograde. A lot of people have heard of Mercury retrograde. And if you can picture a diagram of us traveling through space, orbiting the sun, that point, especially with Mercury, because it's zipping around the sun so quickly, it's that point where it is at an angle where it looks like it's going backwards in the sky, because it's just reached that point in its own orbit where it loops back around. And so in the sky, from our perspective on Earth, it looks like it does this in the sky. It's a little bit of a loop. It comes up and over. If you say this is the ecliptic in the night sky, it does this kind of a motion. And that happens more or less with all the planets, only when they're the planets beyond us, so Mars, but also especially the outer planets. It's more so that we're moving away from it, and when we're going around the other side of the sun, then it looks like it's suddenly traveling backward because of the angle of our view of it in the solar system. So that's the caveat with the greater conjunct, is that as it does these 3 points of conjunctions in 20-year intervals, 19 to 20-year intervals, you do have, at the transition to new signs, you sometimes have it getting ahead early, and you do that for once, sometimes twice, and then it'll actually go back to the previous elemental sign and do a conjunction there, and then continue forward for the bulk of that whole elemental signs 200-year cycle. So just as an example, for the last 200 years we've been having greater conjuncts in earth signs. They've been in Virgo, Taurus, or Capricorn. And the exception was in 1980 we had the first conjunction in an air sign, and so that was ahead of schedule. It was like a preview of what was to come with the next 200 years of conjunctions in air signs, and that was in Libra. It was actually, again, due to retrograde. This is another unique thing that sometimes happens, is you'll get 3 conjunctions in a row within a very short period of time. So this was 1980, 1981, and another one in 1981, because you had Jupiter catching up to Saturn, slowing down. So what happens, there's that station where there's the exact point where they're conjunct perfectly, but they're also still close. And because the Earth is then moving away, but Jupiter is still moving, Saturn and Jupiter would both be going retrograde because of the angle of the Earth in perspective to them, but not exactly at the same time, just because Saturn is slower, so Jupiter's catching up ahead. And then once they're both finished their retrograde, then they go back on each other and they conjunct again. And then as we complete more, then they come back and finish conjuncting for the 3rd time. So in the sky it looks like the conjunct. It looks like it's passing, Jupiter's passing Saturn, but then they go back on each other. They're actually both in retrograde, but Saturn's a slower retrograde. And then they pass again, and then they catch up and go forward again at the same time. If that's not too confusing, I hope you kind of got the gist of it. But that was the 1980 period where there's the preview of air sign conjunctions. And then in 2000 we had a conjunction in the final Earth sign of Taurus. So before that 1980 conjunction in Libra, we had about 180 years prior of Earth sign conjunctions. So really in 1820 there was the last fire sign conjunction, but even then in 1800 we had an Earth sign conjunction. So again, there's also that layover point in the previous changeover from fire to Earth sign conjunctions. So this upcoming one is, we're back to air, and it's the start of 200 years of solid air conjunctions. And at any given time that these conjunctions happen, they're generally not too bad, not too good. They can be a mix of both, depending on, for oneself, for your personal chart, it depends on the relationship of those planets conjuncting in relation to other things going on in your chart, your natal chart. Generally for the whole planet, they lean towards the benevolent side, because Jupiter is the most benefic planet. It brings a beneficial side to Saturn's more tearing down of structures type quality to it. Interestingly, that one happens right after the US election, which is in early November. So just a month later, or just a month and a half later, you get this astrological alignment, which should be pretty good. It's also happening at 2 degrees and 3 minutes of Aquarius. If you don't know what minutes are, there's about 60 minutes per degree. It's just a smaller increment of measurement within each degree because, especially when you get into larger, slower moving planets, the minutes help be more precise in predicting things when things are hitting certain points. And this is also conjunct a fixed star, so at any point we can sometimes look to see if there's any fixed stars, meaning stars in other constellations usually, but there's some other things like stars that aren't part of constellations, but they're particularly bright and close to us. And they've been discovered in the past to have certain qualities associated with when certain things happen in alignment with them. And this is the star of Altair in the Aquila constellation, which is the Eagle. So that's not one of the usual 12 zodiacs. So this is a constellation that's off the ecliptic, but when that conjunct happens, it happens to be in alignment with a star in the neck of the Eagle. And this I just thought was interesting to mention. I wouldn't, and I'm not an expert in fixed star astrology, but I wanted to mention it just because it's interesting with the qualities associated with this star and actually the whole constellation. It's a very martial Jupiterian type association, and I think that's fitting to have an eagle, the symbol of Rome, the symbol of the US, the symbol of, you could say, imperialism, just having that association so soon after the 2020 election. Generally, the conjunction, if it's in your chart, like you were born during a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it generally brings wealth and success. But again, that is always dependent on other aspects, where it's located, whether one planet is overpowered over the other. And that's getting beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about in this video, but what we're really wanting to talk about is the macro cycles of what this means. And that changeover point from these conjunctions happening in one element to another, this is the 200-year cycle. This is the most significant one. And the 800-year cycle is just all 4 elements, they happen in an order and then it repeats. So generally what this signifies is the rise and fall of empires, leaders, but in particular also it's just the changes in a style of an empire. So what phase it's in, I guess you could say, more than style. Generally what I've found in going through history and also looking at a table of these past conjunctions and thinking about what empires and civilizations were prominent at the time of any one of these periods. And I've heard a lot of different people touch on this, but I don't think they've quite broken it down the way I have. I could have just rediscovered something other people have talked about, but generally I just hear people talking about air sign conjunctions being when empires fall. And it seems to somewhat be the case, but it's a little more nuanced than that. Definitely earth sign conjunctions, which we've just completed, have been sort of like times of prosperity or high production, building and sort of that rooting in and building of structures as we know other signs to be associated with, or the earth element. And air just brings the winds of change. So really we can think of air sign conjunctions as being a time of change for empires. It's a new phase. They either adapt to a new thing that's going on or they fall. Definitely when you look to the past, there's been many that have fallen during these periods, but there's been many that have changed. So for example, I'll get into specific dates later, but the Roman Empire, the western half fell to barbarians 2 lots of air sign conjunctions ago. So the previous time we had air sign conjuncts was 600 years ago. And if you go back another 800 years from that, you would have had the start of that period where the Roman Empire had just already split between the Western and Eastern empires, and the Western Empire fell to the barbarian invasions. That was during air sign conjunctions, and it's actually the Eastern Empire that carried on and changed. So we can't say that the entire empire collapsed during that period of air sign conjunctions. It just half of it collapsed, but the other half had to adapt and become a new thing. It was entering a new phase. So in total, the Roman Empire, if we go back to ancient Rome all the way to the fall of, I guess, Constantinople, you actually had nearly 2 entire 800-year cycles that it lasted. In total, it was actually 2 lots that civilizations tend to just be one. So the question I think on everyone's mind is, will the U.S. be considered like its own empire here, and is it going to, what's going to happen? We don't know for sure. We know there's multiple macro cycles coming up in short order here that are all entering new phases. This is a huge one. Obviously, we've talked about the new age of Aquarius, which is quite fitting for this conjunction that's coming up to be in Aquarius, kicking off this new air sign, 200 years of greater conjunctions. But there's also Pluto, which is coming up, I think in 2022, the beginning of 2022. It's coming up to the degree it was at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So that is a 256 to 258 year cycle that Pluto has. And that's not a complex thing. It's not to do with other planets and stuff. It's just Pluto's 258 year cycle through all of the signs, the zodiac signs. It's only now just coming back to where it was at the founding of the U.S. So that is significant. And for that to line up so close to these new air sign conjuncts is quite interesting. So that I'm getting ahead of myself because I do want to do a video once I've done kind of like each individual macro cycle and the ideas behind it and when they're happening, if they're significant to, say the next decade. But I did have to throw it in because it's not that far off, and I think it is tied into just the whole vibe of what I think everyone sees us going through right now, because it is quite an interesting time to be living through. So I mentioned earth and air sign conjunctions, but there's also water and fire. And the order I've put it on in terms of empires is water tends to be the germination of empires or civilizations. Fire tends to be like rapid expansion, often with military and warring force behind it. Earth, as I said, is that building construction type period where a lot of resources are extracted from the earth. And then, of course, the air sign is just the winds of change, whether it's another force coming in and toppling the empire, or it just collapses on its own. And if you get really nitpicky, you can definitely find examples of sort of small civilizations that didn't exactly follow these precise orders. But generally, when you look through history, the biggest empire of that time period, of whatever time period you're looking at, tends to follow this cycle. So if we go back, say, to the colonial era, the last time there were water sign conjunctions, all of the expansive setting up of colonies happened during the water sign conjunctions. So it was literally boats going out from monarchy type states in Europe, boats going out across the world, exploring the ocean, the world, and finding new lands. It's quite fitting for this to be the water element. And then they were setting up outposts in various parts of the world. The very first one would have been Spain taking the Canary Islands in 1402. And that changeover from air sign conjunctions to water were a bit funny in that there was a water sign conjunction in 1365. Then there was 2 in the next 2 following great conjunction years. So in 1385 and 1405, those were air sign conjunctions. And then it flipped back over to water sign conjunctions in 1425, and this was in Scorpio. And actually there were 3 of them, because it, again, did that funny retrograde thing I was talking about. So even though that one was a little off in that there was 2 lots of greater conjuncts before it had fully switched over to the water sign, but we got that beginning of them in the end of the 1300s. And interestingly, even though the Canary Islands were, discovered by Spain in 1402, we started to see a real ramp up of exploration and colonization in that 15th century, so the 1400s, by the mid 1400s. And then Portugal had been taking some of those first North African colonies in the middle of the 1400s. And then in 1482, they had taken the first sub-Saharan colony in, I'm not sure exactly the location there, I just have that date written down. Portugal also established the first Indian colony in 1432. And obviously we have Christopher Columbus in sailing the ocean blue in 1492. And so even though it was slow to start, it really accelerates to the end of the 1400s there, where these colonies are being set up. And yeah, have some fighting for different colony outposts. But things don't really pick up until the 1600s. And that's that changeover point from water sign conjunctions to fire sign conjuncts. And one other thing I wanted to say about the fire sign I forgot to mention is that it's not just warring, it's also the establishment of trade. So trade deals with resources. You can definitely think of that as more of an earth sign quality, but it does begin in fire sign. The Dutch East India Company, for example, was founded in 1602, and it lasted almost exactly 200 years and just waned out right at the end of the fire sign conjunctions, and just kind of collapsed just due to other trade having been established by that point. A lot of the fighting for territory and the expansion into and pushing out the natives or subjugating them or whatever these different colonies and colonists and empires did to them happened during the fire sign conjuncts. Another thing we saw, obviously, was the Revolutionary War at the end of the fire sign conjunctions, and that firmly established the U.S. as its own unit. And so really, I tend to think of the U.S. as, even though it is its own empire, and definitely in the last 200 years and more, it's been seen as its own empire, just due to the globalized nature of the world, it is definitely a product and an offshoot of a bigger empire, which has been the British Empire, or the Anglosphere, because when we look at the spread of the British Empire from the colonial times in the germinating period, that's when they got all of their extra territory. All of these things built up at once. Yes, the U.S. was unique and has been unique in its own ways. Everything has kind of grown at the same rate, and has followed these same periods of conjunctions. And ironically, we all face the same hurdles in various forms to varying degrees as we approach these greater air sign conjunct periods. So air sign conjunctions are often associated with barbarian hordes of varying types. I mentioned the ones from the sort of 2 cycles ago, the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire falling to the Germanic and Gallic barbarian invasions. And then we also obviously had, just in the last one, the major force that actually caused the collapse of some empires was the Mongol hordes. And if you think about it, the Mongol invasions or expansion was not something that stayed true. Like they did their thing and then they collapsed. They were a very brief sort of flash in the pan type effect. And same you could say of the Germanic barbarians. Even though they invaded Western Rome and it collapsed, they kind of, to whatever degree they stayed behind and stayed there, they became the new civilizations and empires that rose up out of that, because you could say that was then a new type of Roman Empire with Charlemagne and all that, with the Franks over time. But it's not exactly how the Mongol hordes functioned. They expanded rapidly, created the biggest empire in history, and then they collapsed in on themselves quite in just a few generations. If we go back in time, again, let's just kind of, again, look at the same period of the germinating, then expanding, and then the building, and then collapsing. We'll look at some other examples from history. If we go back to the Age of Aries, back to around 400 BC to 200 BC, we saw similar types of events in the Archaic period in Greece. And as an aside, the Archaic period for Greece started around 800 BC. And that's kind of when Greece was dominated by Athens, and that was their central hub of the Greek culture. It's kind of weird to call it an empire because it wasn't, it was more democratic, obviously. But greater conjunctions in air signs began around 400 BC, and just in 404 BC, Sparta finally defeated Athens in battle, and they took over, and you could kind of see or say that Greece entered a new period. So it wasn't a total wiping out of the Greek people, because obviously Spartans were Greek, but they were warring city-states. And this is different when you go back this far in time too, because these are smaller groups of people that were called civilizations than we think of in the past few cycles, just because the population of the planet was different. The distance of travel was in a much tighter area. But Sparta defeated Athens. They kind of transformed from a republic. They call it an oligarchic rule. Then in 356 BC, Alexander the Great was born. So we already had the air sign conjunct effect on Greece happen. But then, if you know the history of Alexander the Great, this is one of these rapid expansion air sign qualities where he just came onto the scene once he was a young adult and dominated. So first, in 344 BC, he broke Persia's hold on the Balkans, basically reunited the Balkans under Greek authority, and he began a series of campaigns that were just one after the other that had the whole empire sweep eastward. He destroyed the Persian rule. We all know the story of Alexander the Great to some degree. He went down into Egypt and all the way to the Kush of India. And that was the most rapid expansion of an empire in history up until that point. But that effect didn't remain. It did shrink back, obviously, over time. And that is definitely an air sign quality that we witnessed there. So simultaneous to all this, the establishment of Rome was occurring. Now, obviously, the founding of Rome as a city-state and a small region went all the way back to 753 BC, but it was during the air sign conjuncts that they actually began looking like they had some potential for something. And there was some periods where they almost fell as almost like a mini starting empire because they were already enduring barbarian raids at that time through that air sign conjunction period. The first Gallic invasions were happening, and that could have been a point, if they had truly broken Rome's vigor, that it might not have ever kicked off as such an enduring empire. You had obviously two Punic wars between Carthage and Rome at that time. Carthage was definitely reaching a point of its peak in terms of their prominence, but they were the one invading on the Roman side of the Mediterranean. You had Hannibal coming across and then coming down over the Alps during this period. But it was actually the Third Punic War when Rome finally broke Carthage. And that was in the changeover to water sign conjunctions. And that's synonymous, again, if we're talking about water, where they crossed the Mediterranean. It was the Romans who crossed. And they were able to break Carthage and begin taking territory that was once part of Carthage. And that was sort of the end of the Phoenician Empire. If you're enjoying the content that I'm putting out, check out a link below to watch some videos and read about a privacy browser that's free to download, which, if you happen to enjoy it and use it for a short period of time, they actually send me a bit of money, which will help me in continuing to create this content. It is a unique browser that, besides all its privacy features, also allows you to make a bit of money through a cryptocurrency when you enable the ad feature on the browser. And it actually blocks out other types of ads, but it has its own network of advertisers within the browser, which pops up very sort of not that distracting ads. They're not really in your face or anything, but they're just in the top corner and where they appear. You can see what they look like on the screen right now, and you just close them. And depending on the price of the cryptocurrency itself, you get a small fraction of a BAT for every ad you see, and BAT stands for Brave Attention Token. The browser, of course, is called the Brave browser. And, you know, when the price is high, you get smaller denominations of the BAT token for each ad that appears. But if the price is very low, like it is right now, you actually get a bigger chunk. And so every dozen or 2 dozen ads or so, you're going to get an entire unit of BAT, one token. And as you accumulate these tokens, you can either hold on to them for when the price of BAT goes up, probably with next time Bitcoin goes up in price, or you can use it to tip content creators online, whether it's just through their own website or even over Twitter, I believe, has a feature where you can enable BAT tipping. I didn't get too deep into the whole Babylonian Phoenician periods. With this, it would be an interesting thing to look at, and I'm not as well versed in that period in history just off the top of my head, but Carthage was its own place and had its own expanded empire, and even though it was sort of an offshoot of those past civilizations, it was still different in its own right. So it was definitely sort of the waning phase of that ancient empire, and Rome at that point took it over. And all throughout that period of these water sign conjunctions, Rome was setting up little outposts. They were fortified cities in time, but they weren't really expanding yet. They were just points all along the Mediterranean where they were setting up trade routes and cities and things. And actually, if we're gonna jump back to that air sign conjunct where we had Alexander the Great and the first two Punic Wars and other things, over in Asia at this time period, we had in 399 BC, the sort of proto-Huns were doing their thing and threatening a lot of the Asian empires. They took over a lot of northern Asia. They threatened the Han ethnic controlled Southeast Asian areas. And that's actually when the Great Wall of China first began to be built at the 221 BC. So from 399 BC to 221 BC, that's all air sign conjunctions. So again, we had this expansive force which threatened another empire. It was the Han ethnicity. I'm not exactly sure off the top. I didn't write down which dynasty that was. Might have been the Han dynasty. But that was the dynasty and the peoples who wanted to create that resistance against it. So even though the Huns, those proto-Huns who would eventually become the Mongolians, they were already doing their things and doing the rapid expansion during the air sign conjuncts. And as I was saying with Rome, you had that fire period where it really rapidly expanded. And that's when, if you look at like maps of changing history of the Roman Empire, that's when you see it really expand. So you see Rome or Roman Empire being this thin band all around the Mediterranean in different parts. It's not actually even all connected up yet. And then as that all expands and becomes one giant massive empire and it's all connected, that was largely during the fire conjunct periods. And it was actually at where Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, I believe it was. And once all of that was settled, it was actually that point of Rome going from fire signs to earth signs was when it went from sort of a republic to an empire with a single ruler, was obviously when Julius Caesar took over, and then the preceding Caesars after that. That was turning into the earth sign conjuncts. And then, of course, when we get into the air, the empire had already split into two halves, the Eastern and Western empires, and that's when the Western Empire collapsed in the air sign conjuncts, but the Eastern Empire continued on, and then it eventually collapsed another 800 years later due to the Ottoman Turks. Now, obviously, everyone's familiar with the definitive end date of 1453, given by historians as the fall of Constantinople. But the Byzantine Empire was actually a very gradual decline. And if you look at the date of 1453, it actually happens during about a third of the way into the water sign conjunct period. But the actual fall is widely accepted to have begun in roughly after the death of Emperor Manuel in 1180, the September of 1180, which was in the very start of the air signs. And his son, who came to power, was only 11 years old, and he was not a very good ruler. He was quickly overthrown, and what preceded that was many years of infighting within the Byzantine sort of elite. And then you also had uprisings in different parts of the Byzantine Empire in the preceding decades and even the next century or two. And you had all sorts of factions, both from within the empire as well as outside influence, that just gradually broke the entire structure and machinery of the empire down. You had the Bulgarian Empire rising to the north. You had the sort of amalgamation of various Muslim states to the east on the Anatolian Peninsula, slowly whittling away and taking cities and sections of the empire. And at a certain point, they actually got defeated by the Mongols from their eastern side. And even though the Mongols couldn't penetrate sort of the Byzantine, more fortified areas, because horseback riders aren't that effective against fortified cities, they weakened all the Muslim states, which allowed, obviously, towards the end of the air sign conjuncts for the Ottoman Empire to rise, come to power, and as we know, that's the power that caused the fall of Constantinople. So all of the things that shaped the definitive fall of the Byzantine period, the Byzantine Empire, was all set in stone during the air sign conjuncts. And this is just a great historical example of how accurate these periods were in deciding or describing and predict possibly the rise and fall of these different world powers. So yes, when you look at the dates, the actual exact fall of the Constantinople, the capital, was a full 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So in total, the entire Roman Empire lasted 2,000 years. But that is just 2 full 800-year cycles plus some. So there's a bit at the start, and then there's a bit tacked on at the end. Because that final collapse in 1453 was a little ways into the water sign conjuncts there. So it's like this changeover of empires and different offshoots of different previous empires roughly correlate to all these different periods. It's quite fascinating to look through. If you have specific empires or periods in history I haven't mentioned, it's worth checking out. I've got a link below for the full tables, which go back to 600 BC. It could be pretty easy to extrapolate back further in time. Perhaps there's other tables available online. But otherwise, they do roughly line up more or less with the 200-year periods because there's not a huge divergence of when that changeover happens when you look at these. So the question remains, what are we going to be facing in this upcoming 200 years of air sign conjunctions? Those of us alive now only have that to look forward to, unless you are planning to live longer than that. It's an interesting time in history. There's a lot of factors going on at once which make it hard to predict, I think. The things that could be the barbarian invasions, obviously the immediate thought is that the waves of migration are or have been the barbarian invasions. I am skeptical of that conclusion, of them being that. It might be one aspect of that, and during these periods there's multiple things that can happen. If we think about just the whole epidemic we're dealing with now, or the pandemic, to whatever degree it's actually significant, it's obviously impacting people because of the way the governments are making us behave. To what degree is this air transmitted illness going to impact the coming period? Obviously it's not going to go on endlessly, but it's interesting that even though we haven't gotten to that point yet where we have the air sign conjuncts, you could say the air sign conjuncts have started because it started in 1980. And as we saw in history, these things aren't cut and dry, especially with the macrocycles. They don't happen right on the dates of the conjunct. These are the setting of a new period, and it's like a flavor for the next 200 years. And obviously other things that are going on will generate and lean towards things happening in a certain way. So like we've been in the age of Aquarius, that's going to flavor everything that happens over a period of time. And when you have multiple things that all have the same flavor, you're going to likely see events that transpire in that way. So age of Aquarius, greater conjunct in Aquarius, in air signs now. There is a theme here that's been going on. The issue, like I was saying, with mass migration being the barbarian invasions, is they're not a unified counter force. They're almost like a controlled army by the elites of our own country. So if you think of one of these past examples, so Western Rome, when it was dealing with Germanic barbarians, it wasn't the elites of Rome that were bringing the barbarians in to attack their own people. That's what we're dealing with. The point I'm attempting to make in describing the difference between sort of this modern influx of refugees and mass immigration compared to these past air sign conjunct periods, which were more invasionary military forces, such as the Mongols or the barbarians that invaded the Western Roman Empire, or even going back to Alexander the Great. Those were organized, mass militarized groups of people, and you can obviously make the argument in a disjointed way about refugees these days of being like an irregular army of the elite as a means of diversion against the working class and even middle class people within the West to preoccupy them with just the physical bodies of the people, but also the crime and conflict that those people bring, the competition for resources, etc. And that is an attack by the elites against the lower classes, whereas in these past air sign conjuncts, those empires that fell from the Mongols or Alexander the Great or the barbarians, it actually didn't affect the lower class people as much. So a lot of people in the Roman Empire at that time, when it finally fell, were very upset and disgusted with their elites. And when the barbarians came in, they weren't slaughtering the people, they weren't bringing in crime, they took out the heads of the state. But what happens during the air sign conjuncts is the brain or the head of the snake of a civilization or empire, sort of the waning days of it, is taken out by this winds of change effect. So what I see the refugee influx today as being, which obviously it actually began before the air sign conjuncts, it stretches back to World War II. For the UK, there was immigration really picking up after World War II there. And then obviously in the US, you've always had Hispanic immigration to varying degrees. And yes, these things picked up after the 60s. But even then, that's still ahead of schedule if we're going by the phases of these conjunct air signs. When we're getting up to this conjunct coming up, there's actually been a pullback of migration due to this pandemic we're facing. And that, to me, is synonymous that it was the elites all along that have been fueling this. So it's much more appropriate, I think, to call the mass influx of refugees to have been a product of the Earth sign conjuncts from the previous 200-year cycle, which we're just closing up. And it's an expression of the last-ditch effort by the elites to continue to try and extract resources while they see the writing on the wall that there's a mass wake-up of people going on. So this is just their way of sort of digging in their heels. And if we're entering this new macro cycle, I think we can expect that as the elites fall, that tool of theirs, that use of sort of an irregular army from the third world, isn't going to be as easily at their disposal because people are waking up to that. So I just wanted to highlight that difference because I do see people, when analyzing this, sort of claiming that these mass third world migration is comparable to like organized barbarians or the organized Mongol armies or Alexander the Great. Yeah, it's not comparable at all. So if there's going to be any kind of argument for that, I think it would be a counter pressure from an invading force. And due to the nature of just being in a new age, it might not be an invading force. It could just simply be cyber attacks happening all online and bringing down infrastructure or tampering with things. There's so many different variables when you start getting into modern technology and the way things are done at this point. You could have scenarios with other countries. The rise of Russia, for example, might be occurring as a empire force that they've been desiring for a long time and planning for, with long-term planning in their very centralized type power government where they're able to do that sort of long-term planning. And that's, I think, going to be the downfall of the West, is we've just been so liberalized that we don't have this systematic defense against the weak points in our civilization. To what degree it's going to be outside forces versus forces from the inside that take it over or cause it to collapse, or it fractures somewhere and one part of the anglosphere collapses completely and another part just changes form and becomes something new and different. We'll see, but I think that is more likely, is that we're going to see definitely parts falling away, turning to other things, maybe being swept up into other empires that are rising. If we are relating this to the age of Aquarius and looking at the past age as being vastly different, the Piscean age ruled by Jupiter and Neptune. Another name for Neptune is the Lord of the Invisible Empire, and Neptune is associated with illusions. And what is a big theme we've been seeing? We've been seeing sort of like a dropping of the veil, of seeing through who's behind media, who's behind global finance, who's behind all of these illusionary tricks that is kind of pull us in directions a lot of the general population doesn't like. So to what degree is the current establishment sort of subsumed and subverted by this invisible empire? And to what degree is this new sign of air conjunctions going to be about that empire possibly falling? I think there's a lot of shifting elements going on, and again, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think there's a lot of potential for good things to happen, for the right things to begin happening. We need to spread this information, not specifically the information in this video, but the things that will bring down that invisible empire that overarches the Anglosphere, but a lot of the other things that have been going on in the world and the other elements that they're having difficulty controlling. A lot of the stuff with China has to do with the fact that China's still trying to do their own thing despite certain elements of their own control being in place, that's being threatened. Russia's definitely subverted. That's another, I can't get into that actually. Yeah, these are all just things to think about. And is this empire we're in going to carry forward for another 800 years, another cycle of air signs that last all throughout the air signs, then into water sign, then fire, and then earth again? Or is this it? Are we all going to collapse and become identityless mass hordes of mocha Americans? Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. Do all the social media and check out the links in the drop down menu below, and I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.